Italian Neorealism and German Trümer films, two types of films that to some degree parallel one another. Both emerge in the post-war period. Their source nations are in ruinous states, but also perpetrators during the war. Themes of reconstruction, responsibility connect them, but the similarities extend to stylistic components as well. Beyond somewhat surface connections between the two, both movements can illuminate how each nation's filmic output embodies the post-war mindset. In doing so, the deficiencies in the Trümer film and neorealist films can also speak to the depth of post-war trauma. Roberto Rossellini's 1945 film Rome Open City launches Italian neorealism. Its German counterpart, Wolfgang Staudt's The Murderers Are Among Us, would kickstart the Trümer film movement in 1946, both films confronting the immediate aftermath of the war. At the apex of neorealism and the tail end of the Rubble film period, Rossellini in 1948 would effectively combine the two in his film Germany Year Zero. By examining Rome Open City, The Murderers Are Among Us, and Germany Year Zero, we hope to answer the question, how does a nation reflect on such a past, when not only are the wounds still open, but the general attitude is to forget? Before prodding these individual neorealist and rebel films, we first wish to frame our analysis. Plenty of past criticism has argued for and against the relationship between Italian neorealism and German rebel films, asserting that the similarities are merely surface. In Paul Rotha's A Survey of World Cinema, he characterizes the rebel films as self-pitiful, whereas Rome Open City, his example of neorealism, is devoid of such, instead exemplifying post-war honesty. Others, such as Erich Rentschler, see the Trümer film aesthetically as a convergence of expressionism and neorealism, indebting them to the Weimar era of German film as much as the mode of realism they employ. Nevertheless, instead of questioning the presence of a relationship between the Trümer film and neorealism, we instead offer a comparison of the manifestation of war-associated trauma and guilt, rather how Italy and Germany each handled their role in the war through film.
The relationship between fascism and Italian cinema is a complicated one. Due to the fact that while Italy was under the fascist government, a lot of changes were made in regard to the production and distribution system and to the educational method for film criticism. During this period, a lot of films would welcome the fascist values, while others would keep their leftist sympathies, therefore creating a non-unified ideology in the Italian film industry. The fascist state did not participate in the Italian film industry right away, but instead it was a slow intervention. At first, the fascist government was interested and well aware of the power of cinema only as a potential source of information, but not as a possible patriotic culture emblem to show abroad. In fact, as the fascists realized how many people they could reach with this medium as a form of influence, in 1924 and 1925, they started taking control over the biggest channel of information in the country and recapitalized a private company, later named Istituto Luce, acronym for l'Unione Cinematografica Educativa, in order to expand the national propaganda by making in 1926 the screening of its film compulsory in all cinemas in the country. The fascist government's interests started shifting from the newsreels and educational film screenings to a bigger involvement in the commercial cinema too, around the 1930s. Due to interventions by the fascist government, most Italian filmmakers and producers either support the regime or adjusted their ideology in order to keep working profitably in the industry. Most films did include the obvious fascist ideology, such as patriotism, war propaganda, militarism, economic self-sufficiency, and self-sacrifice for the nation. But instead, they were portraying the belief that the higher class in society could not be changed, but only challenged. From the 1930s, therefore, when the fascist government started to take a major interest towards foreign policy and war, more war-themed films or films with a predominant fascist ideological plot and characters were produced. Even after the fall of the fascist regime and the dismantlement of its government, there were some fundamental continuities between the cinema of the fascist period and that of the early post war years. Some of these continuities, such as the technical and practical ones, are more obvious and identifiable than others. The ideological continuities are harder to identify, and it is a major conflict between scholars who try to understand the Italian cinema before and after the fascist period, because the way one answers the ideological continuity between the 1930s and 1950s really depends on how far one sees the films of the earlier period as having been pervaded by the fascist ideology, as opposed to a more loosely cleric conservative one. Therefore, it is hard to identify due to the fact that the answer will lie in the perception of the people ideas over the themes and ideology of films made before and after the fascist regime.
Amidst the ruins of Berlin, trees are in bloom as they have never been. Sometimes at night you feel in
Germany,
awe
1945. A nation in disrepair for more reasons than one could count. Remnants of bombed buildings clogged the streets. Industrially, politically, and socially, the country was equally in ruins. As the Allied forces entered, the country was divided amongst them. The American zone, the British zone, the French zone, and the Russian zone. For the city of Berlin, which lay square in the Russian-occupied zone, its status as the nation's capital prompted the Allies to further divide the city between them. This period of Allied occupation would, for the most part, last until the East-West division that would occur in 1949. During this time, there was a general effort to rebuild physically and economically, while the introduction of denazification measures from the Allies sought to remove any traces of Nazi ideology from the country. The German film industry during the war was a similar vessel for the Nazis as it was for the fascists. Film was a tool that, when wielded as propaganda, could rally support and enforce indoctrination. It was also a means of distraction for the German public. Thus, the two prominent types of films being produced and exhibited at this time were pure entertainment films and Nazi propaganda. Despite the implosion of the country at the end of the war, the film industry was one of the few areas to continue production throughout. Thus, when the Allies entered the country, it became a crucial element in the denazification efforts. Just as the medium had been used to impart Nazi ideology under the Third Reich, the Allies saw in it potential to re-educate the public. Among them, the Russians were the first to capitalize on German film production, and largely due to geography. In Berlin, of the film studios not pulverized, the Soviets were able to seize those still functioning, based on their location in the divided city. Additionally, and perhaps most crucial, was the location of a film stock production plant outside the city, still in the Russian zone. While this relative abundance of resources aided the early Soviet efforts to back German film production, the Western zones were also quick to follow. Beyond the industry itself, the public response following the war was to create a space to discuss the post-war mindset, an open forum of sorts, where Germans could consider the resounding guilt and responsibility that faced them. Wolf Dietrich Schnurr was one in particular to denote film as such a space. With the conditions in place to nurture a German film revival and a demand for self-examination and confrontation, the Trümer film was born. The Trümer film, a Rubble film, for its direct translation to debris or rubble, was not quite a genre nor a film movement, but still defines the German post-war films from 1946 to 1949. As stated, Berlin, along with the rest of the country, was in ruins, a look that would provide a pervasive backdrop to these films. However, the Rubble film was more than simply an aesthetic. To some degree, one can consider the Trümer film a reactionary cinema, reacting to the guilt of a nation for the atrocities it had committed. Through the adoption of realist techniques, most of which were out of necessity, just as with Neorealism, as well as the infusion of expressionism, the Trümer film attempted to look inwards at the state of the nation and national identity exactly as it was, in ruins.
A perfect example in order to show the continuities between the cinema of the fascist period and that of the early post-war years in Italy is Rome Open City by Roberto Rossellini. This film was filmed right after the fall of the fascist regime. It was filmed in 1945, 2 years after the deposition of Benito Mussolini, and it portrays a strong view over the Italian resistance, rendering a full image of every type of person in the Italian society, from children to clergy. Rome Open City does a perfect job displaying the permanent and human consequences of war as the everyday struggle of Italians in a crumbled society through the strategic motif of death, which is a constant in the film. For example, Pina's senseless death, Giorgio's death as a result of brutal torture by the hand of police, and Don Pietro's death by the hands of a firing squad at the end of the movie. Rossellini tells this story through the eyes of ordinary and working class people in order to be able to best portray the intersection of morality and mortality with the theme of faith and war, which is carried and sustained only by the human perseverance of its characters. Through the constant display of death of the main characters and the despair that the audience can perceive from the film's aesthetic and its dramatic narrative, Rossellini wants to show Italy and its people as a country deeply wounded by war and by the fascist regime, but at the same time he also wants to show the resistance ideology as the main savior of the old generations and the hope for the new ones in order to build a new and better Italy, scarred by its troubled past.
The first of the Rubble films, and the first German film after the war, was 1946's poignantly titled The Murderers Are Among Us. It was conceived of and directed by Wolfgang Stout, who had initially worked as an actor in several Nazi-era films. As was the case in Italy, the continuation of personnel was ever present in Germany. However, with Stout, his post-war films strongly enforced an anti-fascist perspective. The film sees two characters struggle to adapt to a devastated Berlin, Dr. Hans Mertens and Suzanne Wallner. The former a military surgeon, distraught by his own involvement in the war, and the latter a concentration camp survivor. After Suzanne returns to her apartment to find it occupied by Mertens, the pair begin living together and form a relationship that moves from unfriendly to amicable and eventually romantic. However, Mertens, upon discovering his former commander, Bruckner, still alive, sets out to kill the man. Thematically, The Murderers Are Among Us is evocative of Neorealism. It focuses on the struggles faced by the average citizen following the war, and neither Mertens nor Suzanne live the lavish lifestyle depicted in the white telephone films rejected by neorealists. It is candid in its depiction of the reality of the state of Berlin. The rubble is not hidden but foregrounded. It is evidence of the brutality of the war, and its prominence in Stout's film cannot be understated. The remains of Berlin that litter the streets are not a construction, not a film set, but the true landscape. And the rubble not only consists of crumbled buildings. As Mertens states in the film, buried amongst it are the dead.
Und die Bewohner dieser Straße ihre Toten verscharrten dort, wo sie fanden. Gehen Sie durch die Ruinen. Da finden Sie Ihre Gräber noch.
It also rejects the notion of escapist cinema by featuring characters both victims and perpetrators of the recent past. The film encourages self-reflection. While this and many other Trümer films experiment in various genres such as film noir and melodrama, the cultural relevance anchored by the rubble essentially forbids any such escapist notion. Turning to the reception of the film for a moment, the audience response in Germany was relatively mixed. For some, the realism was frankly too real, the notion of trekking through the very streets depicted on screen a step too far. However, as Wolf-Dietrich Schnurr's intervention at the time would indicate, this and other Trümmer film provided a space to discuss national guilt. There is an emphasis here on the reaction of the German audience, as it is also clear that the film targeted such. Upon its initial release, there were no accompanying English subtitles, and for the American premiere in 1947, according to Box Office, it had to be narrated by Billy Wilder, a director who, a year later, would produce his own supplemental Rubble film, A Foreign Affair. While this and other international contributions, such as The Third Man, The Search, and Berlin Express, would make use of the ruined streets of Germany, as well as Austria, the thematic considerations of guilt and responsibility could only truly be captured by the German filmmakers at this time. Staudt's German state of mind, so to speak, is a mentality of guilt and shared responsibility for the horrors of the war. The expression of this in his film, as previously mentioned, is more reflective of the Weimar era of German cinema than any mode of realism, as stylistically the film does what no neorealist would dare do. Through Dutch angles and various lighting techniques, Staudt invokes German expressionist methods to echo his character's psyche, a technique reminiscent of films such as The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu. The opening shot establishes this style with a canted angle to capture Mertens as he trudges through the rubble. This type of shot is frequently used throughout, especially to capture Mertens as he grapples with the post-war reality. Further, there is an emphasis on shadow, achieved through noir-esque, low-key lighting. Mertens is often shot in this mode of lighting, which exhibits the dark side of his psychological state. To contrast this, Suzanne, a character of innocence and victim of the war, is instead shot with high-key lighting. Staudt's overall mise-en-scène is a psychologically driven composition, through which he focuses the themes of guilt after the war. While a thematic and stylistic analysis underscore the film's address of Germany's role in the war, there are still absences in its examination of this. As some critics, such as Sebastian Heiduschka, indicate, Staudt's film focuses more generally on anti-fascism as opposed to a deeper examination of the role of Germans in the Holocaust. However, as he points out, this is a factor that could be attributed to the production conditions. Those production conditions are especially important in the consideration of this film, since the film industry was under the control of the Allies. As previously established, Germany was divided amongst the four powers, who each oversaw film production in their respective zones. The question then emerges, with post-war German cinema, how heavy was the influence of the Allies? Is this a nation reflecting on itself, or a higher power swaying that reflection? This is a dilemma specific to the Trümmer films, not necessarily relevant to Italy and neorealism. After the war, Italy maintained control over its own film industry, thus neorealism could be seen as a direct reflection of the mindset of its nation. Yet in Germany, there was still some external influence on film production, as is evident by Wolfgang Staudt's own struggle to have his film made. While The Murderers Are Among Us was eventually produced in the Russian sector of Berlin, Staudt had already been denied by the three Western zones before receiving the okay from the Soviets. With that in mind, could a film removed from such external influence, still shot on the same streets of Berlin, carry the same weight?
Roberto Rossellini's 1948 film Germany Year Zero, the final film in his war trilogy, seems to be the convergence point of Italian neorealism and the Trümmer film. A definitive entry in the neorealist canon, the story alternatively concerns a German family in the aftermath of war. How we interpret Germany Year Zero strongly depends on how we watch it, and it consequently depends on how we want to analyze the expression of the single author in a specific time and space. Rossellini shot the film both in Rome and in Germany, combining two countries that both suffer from the tragedy of war and therefore putting together two different visions and receptions of it through the cinematic language. By doing so, he succeeded to create a film that included elements of Italian neorealism and Trümmer film. Thematically, the film's concern with guilt, reconstruction, and responsibility, along with the staple of visual rubble-ridden streets, lend itself to the tremor film tradition. The manifestation of post-war guilt in The Murders Are Among Us emerges in the quest for revenge that Myrtis undertakes after finding Brooklyn alive, a man who ordered the execution of dozens on Christmas Eve. His role is similar to that of her Henning in Rossellini's films. While neither executioner is shown remorseful, it is those under their influence who must contend with their responsibility. And in the case of Germany Year Zero, Rossellini placed that guilt on the shoulders of a child. As one of the main characteristics of neorealist films, Rossellini does not hesitate to have a dramatic and horrible ending, which sees the main character, a child named Edmund, commit suicide after he poisoned his father. In his portrayal of a child balancing between the reflexes and needs of childhood and adulthood, he chooses the act of suicide as to represent the climax of a simple child's game. Stylistically, German Year Zero is a staple neorealist film. In André writings on the film, he asserts that Rossellini realism lies not in the subject matter, but in the style. Rossellini continues the aesthetic he introduced with Roma Ben City, maintaining an objectivity to his mise-en-scène.
Perché senza pietà è cattiva, è la luce di certe sequenze di Germania Anno Zero, e non ci siano zone d'ombra che nascondono niente, tutto si deve vedere perché tutto va ricordato per sempre. Questo era un po', ci sembrava, il segno di questo film.
In both Italy and Germany, a sort of cultural amnesia took hold following the immediate post-war period. In film, the focus of neorealism in the 50s remained on poverty, labor, desperation, among other themes, though without echoes of the war. While in Germany, after the split into East and West, the dominating mode of film would become the Heimatfilm, translated to homeland film, which obliterated any evidence of the war. Instead, these were set in rural spaces and focused on themes of love and family. With this and other new styles ushered in, Germany saw a return to a predominantly escapist cinema. The subject of the war and each nation's history and such would not return to their cinemas for a few decades. In Germany, the horrors would be suppressed in film, at least until the new German cinema movement of the 1970s. The directors of this period, not unlike Edmund of Germany Year Zero, were those who had inherited the burden of guilt and responsibility for the war. In Italy, while no particular movement corresponded with the new German cinema, individual films such as Bernardo Bertolucci's The Conformist and Liliana Cavani's The Night Porter reignited the Italian cinema's concern with its own past. To return to Wolf Dietrich Schnurr's take on cinema during the post-war period, film then and now provides a unique, open forum in times of terror, chaos, and uncertainty.